Hi students, this is Mr. Eckert, and we're going to go through a couple of targets that are in this cells unit. We're going to go through the first two targets, which are pretty quick, and then there'll be a separate video for the third and fourth target and the last two targets. So here's all the objectives for this unit. We're going to, in this video, go through targets 1 and 2. It says you should be able to describe the parts of something called the cell theory, and then you should be able to list the basic parts or structures that are found in every cell. So we'll start with the first one, describing the parts to the cell theory. This is going to be pretty fast because there's only 3 parts to the cell theory. And here they are. All living things are made up of one or more cells. That should sound familiar to you as one of the characteristics of all living things, right? Cells can only arise from pre-existing cells. So if you see a cell, it had to have come from another cell. Now that part of the theory should raise a question in your mind. And that question, of course, is, well, where did the first cell come from? If all cells come from other cells, what about that very first cell? And that's a very interesting question, right? So how did that come about? And if you look in your book or through other sources in biology, you'll see that most biologists believe that it came about through a series of chemical reactions that happened probably in the ocean that got encapsulated in a little bubble, and somehow, some way, those chemicals in that bubble started using energy. Again, another characteristic of life is all living things use energy, they need energy, and have to replace lost energy. So somehow they started using energy and became a living cell. Nobody knows how that happened. There was some famous experiment done by a couple of scientists, Miller and Urey, and they took some gases that they thought were probably present in the early atmosphere, put them in a glass vial with some water, and sparked it with some electricity, and in a matter of few hours in that enclosed glass vessel, they had some proteins, some basic building blocks of proteins. They had amino acids. And so it was largely because of that experiment that scientists believe that maybe lightning streaking through the atmosphere, early atmosphere, could have caused these amino acids that are necessary for building proteins to spontaneously form in the ocean and become encapsulated then and then somehow turn into a living cell. So all living things are made up of one or more cells. Cells only arise from pre-existing cells, and the cell is the most basic form of life. It's the smallest structure for living things. So those 3 things are known as the cell theory, and by the time we get to the test, you should be able to write all 3 of those things down. Target 2 says that you should be able to list the basic parts found in every cell. So just like we said that all living things must share some common characteristics that are true of every single living thing, there are certain structures or parts that are found in every single cell, no matter what kind of cell it is, whether it's a bacterial cell or a cell from a fish or a cell from a human being. So what are those parts? Well, all cells have DNA. So DNA, you know, is the molecule of heredity. It's how cells and traits get passed from, or a cell will pass traits from itself from one cell to the next. So DNA, it makes sense, would be found in every single cell. Now notice it doesn't say nucleus. So that's a common misconception that even adults have, is that all cells have a nucleus. No, they don't. But all cells do have DNA. All cells have ribosomes. Now, ribosomes are a small structure inside of cells that their job is to make proteins. And proteins are the basic building blocks of living things. You want to think of proteins like Legos. What can you build with Legos? Just about anything, right? You can build houses, you can build cars, airplanes, you can really build anything you want. And that's how you want to think of protein. Living things use proteins to build different structures that are necessary for life. The most common misconception that students have about proteins is that they're used for energy. Maybe you're connecting that because proteins, as you know, build muscle, and muscle maybe you associate with energy. But you don't want to think of them that way. Proteins, you want to think of them like building blocks, so think of Lego. So all cells have ribosomes since they produce proteins. All cells have a cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is simply the clear, goopy stuff inside of cells in which everything kind of floats. So all living cells have a cytoplasm. And all living cells have a cell membrane. That, of course, is the outer structure that encloses the cell. Notice it doesn't say cell wall, it's a cell membrane. Membranes are thinner, cell walls are much thicker. So not all cells have a cell wall, but all cells have a cell membrane. Your cells and my cells have cell membranes, but not cell walls. If you just drew a circle on your notes right now to represent a simple cell, what you would have drawn is really two things: the cell membrane, and then the clear part inside that's kind of invisible is, of course, the cytoplasm. And then last, all cells have a cytoskeleton. A cytoskeleton consists of really thin microtubules and microfilaments that provide structure and support for the cell. The cell can actually move things around also on its cytoskeleton. So it's very, very important for all cells. So that's it for the first two targets. That was fairly simple. If you have any questions, again, make sure you ask.